Weaving starts with thread. In the Middle Ages, that thread mostly came from two places. It came from the back of a sheep or from the stalk of a flax plant. Wool and linen were the two great fabrics of the time. They clothed almost everyone, from farmers to kings. Getting wool was a yearly event. In the spring, shepherds would shear their sheep. They used hand shears like big, rough scissors. This gave them a pile of greasy, dirty fleece. The wool was full of dirt, twigs, and lanolin, the natural oil sheep produce. This all had to be cleaned. Women would wash the fleece in tubs of hot water, often with harsh soap or stale urine. The ammonia in urine helped cut through the grease. After washing and rinsing, the wool was laid out to dry. Once clean and dry, the wool needed to be prepared for spinning. There were two ways to do this. For shorter, fuzzier wool fibers, they used cards. These were two wooden paddles with metal teeth set in them. A person would place a bit of wool on one card and brush it with the other. This action teased the fibers apart and aligned them into a soft, airy roll called a rowlog. This process was called carding. It created a woolen yarn that was warm and soft, good for heavy blankets and everyday clothes. For longer, smoother wool fibers, they used combs. Wool combs were tools with long, sharp metal teeth. The wool was loaded onto one comb, and another was used to pull the fibers through the teeth. This process, called combing, removed the shorter fibers and left only the long, straight ones. These were then formed into a bundle called a top. Spinning from a top created a worsted yarn. Worsted yarn was strong, smooth, and less fuzzy. It was used for finer, more durable cloth. The other main fiber was linen. Linen comes from the flax plant. Making linen was a long, complicated process. First, the flax plants were harvested by pulling them up by the roots. They were then dried and rippled, which means pulling the stalks through a large comb to remove the seeds. The next step was retting. This was basically a controlled rot. The stalks were submerged in a pond or a stream, or sometimes just laid out in a dewy field. A bacteria would break down the gummy part of the stalk, freeing the long fibers inside. Retting was a smelly job. After retting, the flax stalks were dried again. Then came the hard physical work. A wooden knife called a scutching knife was used to beat the dried stalks. This broke away the woody outer core. Then, the remaining fibers were pulled through a series of coarse combs called hackles. This was called heckling. It cleaned the fibers and separated the long, fine ones from the short, coarse ones. The short fibers, called tow, were used for rough things like ropes or sacks. The long, fine fibers were ready to be spun into linen thread. So now you have prepared fibers, either wool rolags or flax bundles. The next job was to turn them into thread. This was called spinning. For most of the Middle Ages, spinning was done with a tool called a drop spindle. A drop spindle is simple. It's just a stick with a weight, called a whorl, at the bottom. The whorl acts like a flywheel. The spinner would take a bit of fiber, twist it with their fingers, and attach it to the spindle. Then they would give the spindle a twirl and let it drop, feeding out more fiber as it spun. The spinning motion twisted the fibers together, making thread. When the spindle reached the floor, the spinner would stop, wind the newly made thread onto the stick, and start the process again. Spinning with a drop spindle was slow. It was constant work, and it was almost always done by women. They spun everywhere. They spun while walking to the market. They spun while watching their children. They carried their fibers and spindle with them. A woman's social standing was often tied to her skill with a spindle. The word distaff, the stick that held the unspun fibers, came to mean women's work or the female side of a family. Sometime around the 13th century, a new tool appeared in Europe, the spinning wheel, and it probably came from the East. The early spinning wheels were simple. The spinner would turn a large wheel by hand, which was connected by a drive band to a spindle. This turned the spindle much faster than a drop spindle ever could. It made spinning much more efficient. Later, a foot pedal called a treadle was added, which freed up both of the spinner's hands to manage the fibers. The spinning wheel changed things. A person could produce much more thread in a day. This increase in thread production was necessary to keep up with a growing demand for cloth. But the drop spindle didn't disappear. It was portable and cheap, so it continued to be used, especially in rural areas or by people who couldn't afford a wheel. Whether by spindle or by wheel, the result was the same. A pile of messy fleece or a bundle of tough plant stalks had been transformed. It was now a skein of yarn. It was cleaned, prepared, and twisted into a strong, continuous thread. This thread was the fundamental ingredient. It was the stuff from which the entire medieval world of fabric would be built. Once you have thread, you need a way to turn it into cloth. That machine is a loom. A loom does one basic thing. It holds a set of threads, tight and parallel, so you can weave another thread through them. The threads held tight are called the warp. The thread that weaves through them is called the weft. Weaving is just the simple act of passing the weft over and under the warp, row by row. And it sounds simple, but the looms used to do it could be big and complex. In the early Middle Ages, the most common loom in many parts of Europe was the warp-weighted loom. This was an old design used for centuries. It was a large vertical frame that leaned against a wall. The warp threads were tied to a beam at the top of the frame, but instead of being tied at the bottom, they hung freely. To keep them taut, they were tied in bunches to heavy weights. These weights were often made of baked clay or stone. You can still find these loom weights in archaeological digs. They are a clear sign that people were weaving there. Weaving on a warp-weighted loom was hard work. The weaver had to stand. They would start weaving at the top and work their way down. To create a space to pass the weft through, called the shed, they used heddle rods. A heddle rod was a stick that had loops of string tied to it. Every other warp thread was passed through one of these loops. By pulling the heddle rod forward, the weaver could lift half of the warp threads, creating a gap. They would pass the weft through this gap on a shuttle, a small boat-shaped piece of wood that held the thread. Then they would push the weft firmly up into place with a wooden sword or beater. For the next row, they would let the heddle rod go back. This closed the first gap. Then they had to manually pick their way through the threads to create the alternate shed, passing the weft behind the threads they had just lifted. It was a slow, deliberate process. The width of the cloth was limited by how far the weaver could reach. Because the weaver was beating the weft upwards against gravity, it was hard to make the cloth very dense. Still, this loom was used to make everything from simple tunics to large decorative wall hangings. It was common in homes, and women were the primary users. Then a new technology arrived. Around the 10th or 11th century, the horizontal treadle loom began to spread across Europe. This was a major innovation. It changed weaving from a domestic chore into a professional trade. This new loom was built differently. As the name suggests, it was horizontal, not vertical. The warp threads were stretched between two beams, one at the front and one at the back of a large wooden frame. The weaver sat on a bench in front of the loom. The biggest change was the treadles, as these were foot pedals located under the loom. The treadles were connected by ropes and pulleys to the heddles. The heddles were no longer simple rods, but sets of frames that could be raised and lowered. By pressing one treadle with their foot, the weaver could raise a set of heddles, lifting a specific combination of warp threads. By pressing another treadle, they could raise a different set. This made opening and closing the shed almost instant. The weaver's hands were now free to do just two things: throw the shuttle and beat the weft into place. Throwing the shuttle was faster now, too, and the beating was done with a new tool. A heavy frame holding a comb-like device called a reed was hung from the top of the loom. After passing the shuttle through, the weaver would pull this beater forward, and the reed would smack the weft thread tightly into the fabric. This allowed for a much denser, more even weave, and because the weaver could use their feet, the process was much faster. A weaver on a horizontal loom could produce far more cloth in a day than someone on a warp-weighted loom. The horizontal loom also allowed for wider cloth. Some looms were so wide that they required two weavers sitting side by side to pass the shuttle back and forth. This new technology made weaving more productive. It turned cloth production into a major industry. It was too big, expensive, and complex for most homes. Instead, these looms were set up in workshops in towns and cities. Weaving started to move out of the household and into the marketplace. Of course, the change was not overnight. The warp-weighted loom continued to be used for a long time, especially in more isolated areas like Scandinavia and Iceland. But in the economic heartlands of Europe, like Flanders and Italy, the horizontal loom took over. It became the engine of the medieval textile industry. Alongside the loom itself, a weaver had other small but important tools. They needed a way to get the warp threads onto the loom in the first place. This was done with a warping board or a warping mill, which let them measure out hundreds of long threads all to the same length. They had shuttles to carry the weft and bobbins to wind the weft thread onto before putting them in the shuttle. These tools, from the simple standing loom to the complex treadle loom, were the technology at the heart of medieval life. They were simple machines made of wood and string, but they were responsible for one of the most essential products of the age. They took the simple thread and through a rhythmic, repetitive process transformed it into fabric. Who were the people who sat at these looms? What was their life like? The answer depends on when and where they lived and what kind of loom they used. In the medieval period, there were really two different worlds of weaving. There was the world of the home and the world of the workshop. For much of the Middle Ages, weaving was a domestic task and it was women's work. In a typical peasant household, the family needed cloth for everything: clothes, blankets, sacks. Buying cloth was expensive, so families often produced their own. The women of the house would spin the thread and then they would weave it. The loom, often a warp-weighted loom, would be a major piece of furniture in their small, dark cottage. It might take up a whole wall. Life for a domestic weaver was one of constant labor. Her work was tied to the rhythms of the farm and the family. She would weave in between her other chores: cooking, cleaning, caring for children, and helping in the fields. The cloth she made was not for sale, it was for her family. It was rough, sturdy stuff meant to last. It was probably undyed, the natural color of the wool. This kind of weaving wasn't a job, it was a part of survival. It was an essential contribution to the household economy, even if it didn't bring in any money directly. This domestic reality is reflected in old laws and customs. A woman's weaving tools were often considered her personal property, passed down from mother to daughter. The skill of weaving was part of a young woman's education, as important as knowing how to cook or manage a household. But as towns and cities grew, and as the horizontal loom became more common, a new kind of weaver emerged: the professional. Professional weaving was a trade, a way to make a living, and as it became a formal trade, it increasingly became the world of men. A young boy who wanted to be a weaver would start as an apprentice. At around age 12 or 14, his family would pay a master weaver to take him on. The apprentice would live with the master and his family. He would learn the trade from the ground up. At first, he would do menial tasks: cleaning the workshop, winding bobbins, helping to warp the loom. Over years, he would learn to weave himself, starting with simple, plain cloth and moving on to more complex patterns. An apprenticeship typically lasted for 7 years. During this time, the apprentice was not paid. He worked for his room, board, and training. After his apprenticeship, he became a journeyman. As a journeyman, he could now work for wages. He might continue to work for his former master, or he might travel to other towns, working for different weavers and honing his craft. His goal was to save enough money to one day become a master himself. To become a master, a journeyman had to do two things. First, he had to produce a masterpiece, a piece of cloth that demonstrated his skill and met the high standards of his peers. Second, he had to have enough money to set up his own workshop. This meant buying a loom, which was expensive, and having enough capital to buy yarn. If he could do both, he could be admitted to the Weavers' Guild. The guild was the most important institution in a professional weaver's life. Guilds were associations of craftsmen that controlled a particular trade within a town. The Weavers' Guild set the rules for everything. They set the quality standards for cloth, specifying how wide it had to be, how many threads it should have, and what kind of materials could be used. They fixed prices, they limited the number of apprentices a master could have to prevent too much competition. The guild provided a social safety net, helping the families of members who fell sick or died. But it was also a restrictive body. You couldn't work as a weaver in a town without being part of the guild. The life of a guild weaver was one of long hours and repetitive work. His workshop would be on the ground floor of his house, with his family living upstairs. The space would be dominated by the large wooden loom. The air would be filled with the clatter of the beater and the swish of the shuttle. Weaving was physically demanding. It required a strong back and stamina to sit and operate the loom all day. The work was also economically precarious. The weaver depended on merchants to supply him with yarn and to buy his finished cloth. If the price of wool went up or the demand for cloth went down, his family could suffer. While the professional guilds were mostly for men, women did not disappear from the world of weaving. The wives and daughters of master weavers often worked in the family workshop, helping with tasks like winding bobbins or preparing the warp. Some women, particularly widows, were allowed to take over their husband's business and join the guild. But it was much harder for a woman to become a master weaver in her own right. The most common role for women in the professional textile trade was spinning. The demand for thread created by the fast horizontal looms was enormous. Many women in towns earned a meager income by spinning thread at home and selling it to weavers. So, the life of a weaver could be many things. It could be the unpaid, essential labor of a woman in a rural cottage, weaving for her family's survival. Or it could be the regulated professional life of a man in a town workshop, part of a powerful guild, producing cloth for a wider market. In both cases, their lives were defined by the steady, rhythmic work of turning thread into fabric. Not all cloth was the same. A rough sack for carrying grain was very different from a nobleman's fine tunic. These differences came from three things: the type of thread used, the way it was woven, and how it was colored and finished. The structure of the weave itself was fundamental. By changing the simple over and under pattern of the weft thread, a weaver could create different textures and properties in the fabric. The most basic pattern was the plain weave. The weft goes over one warp thread, then under the next, over one, under one, all the way across. It creates a simple, strong, checkerboard-like structure. This was the most common weave. It was used for everyday linen and wool cloth. It was sturdy and practical. A slightly more complex pattern was the twill weave. In a twill, the weft thread passes over two or more warp threads, and then under one or more. This pattern is stepped one thread over in each successive row, which creates a distinctive diagonal line in the fabric. You can see this today on a pair of jeans. Twill weaves were more durable and flexible than plain weaves. They also draped better. Many finer woolen cloths were made with a twill weave. The most luxurious weave was the satin weave. In a satin weave, the weft thread floats over many warp threads at a time, maybe 4 or more, and then passes under just one. The points where the threads interlace are spread out, so they don't form a clear line. This creates a fabric with a very smooth, lustrous surface because the long floats of thread reflect light. The satin was delicate and expensive to produce. It was used for the clothes of the very wealthy and for church vestments. Weaving satin required a more complex loom with multiple sets of heddles. Beyond the weave, the final character of the cloth was determined after it left the loom. The raw cloth was often rough, uneven, and greasy. It had to be finished. For woolen cloth, the most important finishing process was fulling. The cloth was taken to a fulling mill, which was usually powered by a water wheel. The mill had large wooden hammers that pounded the cloth in a trough of water and a cleansing agent like fuller's earth, a type of clay. This process did two things. It cleaned the remaining grease from the wool, and it made the fibers felt together. The pounding matted the fibers, causing the cloth to shrink and become much thicker, denser, and more water-resistant. The individual threads of the weave would often disappear, creating a smooth felt-like surface. After fulling, the cloth surface was raised by brushing it with teasels, the prickly, dried heads of a plant. This pulled up the loose ends of the wool fibers to create a nap. Then, this nap was sheared off with enormous, heavy shears to create a perfectly smooth and even surface. The quality of this shearing was a mark of a high-quality fabric, but the most dramatic transformation was color. Most everyday cloth was left in its natural color, which meant various shades of white, gray, and brown. But for those who could afford it, cloth could be dyed in a brilliant range of colors. Dyeing was a separate, specialized trade. It was a messy and smelly business. Dyers' workshops were usually located on the edge of town near a river. The dyes themselves came from natural sources. Different plants, insects, and even minerals were used to get different colors. The most common color for ordinary people was yellow, which could be made from a plant called weld. It was cheap and easy to get. Brown could be made from walnut husks. Blue was a very popular color. The main source of blue dye in Europe was a plant called wad. The leaves were harvested, crushed, and fermented into a smelly sludge. The fabric would be dipped into the vat, and it would come out a greenish-yellow color. But as it was exposed to the air, it would oxidize and magically turn blue. Woad produced a range of blues, from pale sky blue to a deep dark navy. Red was a high-status color. A common source of red was the root of the madder plant. It produced a range of colors from orange and pink to a deep brick red. A much more vibrant and expensive red came from an insect called kermes. These insects lived on oak trees in the Mediterranean. They were dried and crushed to produce a brilliant scarlet dye. This color was so expensive that it was reserved for royalty and the highest levels of the church. True green was difficult to achieve with a single dye. Most greens were made by dyeing cloth yellow with weld first and then dipping it in a blue woad vat. Purple was also rare and expensive. Some purples were made from lichens, but the most prized purples were also created by over-dyeing red cloth with blue dye. To make the color stick to the fabric, the dyer had to use a substance called a mordant. The mordant helped the dye molecules bind to the cloth fibers. The most common mordant was alum, a mineral salt that was mined. The quality of the dyeing depended heavily on the skill of the dyer in managing the mordants and the dye vats. Through these processes of weaving, fulling, shearing, and dyeing, a simple yarn was transformed. It became a piece of fabric with a specific texture, density, and color. It could be a coarse, undyed piece of homespun for a peasant's tunic, or it could be a smooth, scarlet, fulled broadcloth fit for a king. The final fabric was a product of many hands and great skill. Weaving was not just a craft. It was the engine of the medieval economy and a foundation of its social structure. The production and trade of cloth touched every aspect of life, from international politics to the clothes on a person's back. The textile trade was, for much of the Middle Ages, the biggest international industry in Europe. At its heart was wool, and the relationship between England and Flanders, a region that is now part of Belgium and the Netherlands, was central to this trade. England was the great sheep-rearing country of Europe. Its pastures produced vast quantities of high-quality wool. But England did not have the expertise to turn this wool into the finest cloth. That expertise was in the cities of Flanders, places like Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres. So, a massive trade route developed. English wool was shipped across the Channel to Flanders. There, in the bustling urban workshops, weavers turned it into highly prized broadcloth. This Flemish cloth was then sold all over Europe by merchants who traveled to great trade fairs in France and Italy. The wealth generated by this trade was immense. It built the great cathedrals and guildhalls of Flemish cities. The politics of England and Flanders were deeply intertwined. Kings went to war over control of the wool trade. It was the oil industry of its day. Cloth was also a powerful symbol of status. In a world with few possessions, clothing was one of the most visible ways to display your wealth and rank. A person's station in life was immediately obvious from the fabric they wore. A peasant wore coarse, undyed wool or linen, often patched and worn. A merchant might wear good quality woolen cloth dyed with a solid, respectable color like blue or green. A nobleman, however, would wear the most luxurious fabrics available. His clothes might be made of fine Flemish broadcloth dyed a brilliant scarlet, or even silk or velvet, which were incredibly expensive imported fabrics. Society was so concerned with people dressing according to their station that many places passed laws to regulate it. These were called sumptuary laws. A sumptuary law might forbid a merchant's wife from wearing silk, or a commoner from wearing certain colors like purple or scarlet. These laws were meant to enforce the social hierarchy and prevent people from aspiring to look like their betters. They weren't always effective, but they show how much importance was placed on the language of clothing. Beyond clothing, woven fabric was everywhere. It was a fundamental part of daily life. Homes were filled with it. People slept on linen sheets and under woolen blankets. Windows might have woolen curtains to keep out drafts. The wealthy hung large, heavy woolen cloths on their stone walls. These were not just for decoration, they provided crucial insulation in cold, drafty castles. These wall hangings could be simple, plain colored cloths, or they could be elaborate tapestries. Tapestries were the highest form of the weaver's art. They were huge, detailed pictures woven from colored wool, silk, and sometimes even silver and gold thread. They were not woven on a standard horizontal loom, but on a specialized vertical loom. The process was incredibly slow and painstaking. A team of highly skilled weavers might take a year or more to complete a single large tapestry. Tapestries were not just art, they were statements of power and wealth. They were commissioned by kings, nobles, and wealthy churches. They depicted scenes from the Bible, mythology, or historical events. A great lord would travel with his tapestries, hanging them in whatever castle he was staying in to transform the cold stone walls into a comfortable and impressive space. They were a portable form of wealth and a symbol of prestige. From the simple sackcloth that carried a farmer's grain to the magnificent tapestry that adorned a king's hall, woven fabric was the material that held the medieval world together. It was a source of warmth and comfort. It was a driver of economies and a cause of wars. It was a canvas for art and a marker of identity. The simple, repetitive act of interlacing one thread with another was one of the most fundamental and important activities of the Middle Ages. It was a craft that dressed, warmed, and defined an entire civilization.